anything is, I think, potentially one of our biggest technical challenges right now. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But I was asked to do a quick overview of some of the environmental implications of the climate crisis on the West Coast. And so I'll go through that a little bit, and then I'll get into sort of the solution space. And some of this stuff, if you're at the keynote, was gone over, so I'm going to breeze through a few of these slides. But just these, impactful facts of, since 1896, average California summer temperatures have risen 3 degrees Fahrenheit, projected to raise 6 more by 2021. This means leading to, obviously, the wildfires, and so that's happening. And while that's happening, we have differences in precipitation. So longer, drier droughts, but when we do have precipitation, more intense precipitation events, which could lead to this increased flood risk. On top of that, there's loss of our mountain snowpack because of warmer temperatures and warmer climate. And this is an issue because the snow really holds this natural water reservoir for us, so that that gradually melts over time, that releases in the spring and the summer. And so if we don't have snowpack that's holding that reservoir, that basically shifts a lot of how the water supply comes to us, and that kind of leads to the flooding and things like that. So, there are a lot of these phenomena that are basically happening at the same time and that are impacting time scales and seasonality. Sea level rise, I think we know this one pretty well, and the different vulnerable populations. I would say, one of the macro trends that we're thinking about a lot is, at what point will it impact things like coastal real estate and those types of markets? I would say, Miami is a really good example of a city that's constantly having to pump seawater, out of their system every year, costing millions of dollars. Right now, real estate prices haven't really taken the hit that I would kind of think insurance companies would start to pay attention to, but I think at some point there will be some indicator events, both on coasts around the world, that will impact coastal real estate prices, which is sort of this pending, looming thing that is kind of unpredictable when it might happen. Coastal ecosystems, so this is getting now more into the water a little bit. I just sort of talked a little bit about the societal impacts. So warmer seawater temperatures, there are physiological effects to organisms. So other researchers have shown that it can blind some marine life. We're basically showing that it, where we study algae, that it enhances certain metabolic rates. It could actually select for harmful algal blooms, things like that. At the same time, increasing temperatures reduces ocean mixing, and that's a big issue, because ocean mixing is what organisms rely on for nutrients to get to them in the ocean, and ocean mixing actually pushes oxygen into the deep ocean, where organisms need oxygen to breathe. And so all of this actually results in what's called expanding oxygen minimum zones. You can find these all over the ocean, but it's a huge area of study in oceanography right now, because as these oxygen minimum zones expand and mixing begins to shut down a little bit around the world, the nutrients that need to flow to like the base of the food webs, the phytoplankton and things like that, is basically slowing. And so they're at the bottom of the chain that then begins for organisms, and we're basically beginning to cut off potentially some of the nutrient and oxygen supply that's driven by this temperature. And then local effects, we have our kelp forests. They're super important for different commercial organisms. They rely on colder ocean temperatures to grow, and with sort of the rise in temperature, as well as some explosion of kelp-eating urchins that we're seeing along the coast, these kelp forests are beginning to be decimated more frequently. And then we have our friend ocean acidification that I think all of you know threatens shell-forming organisms and corals, and we can get deep into that, but we won't. So generally, all of this is to say that ecosystems are experiencing this confluence of stressors. This is ocean acidification, temperature, declining oxygen and nutrients. it's making these interactions make everything very difficult to predict in what way we're going. We know generally it's not good, but in terms of the time and the rate of where we'll see any type of ecosystem like collapse type of effects, that's something that scientists, of course, are always working on actively. So I'm going to shift now into sort of the solution space that I work in. And there are many different things that need to happen, from circular economy to material science, and I work with some of those companies. But my main, where it takes up most of my time is I'm the VP of Science at a carbon removal company called Project Vesta. It's a public benefit corporation with a hybrid nonprofit structure, so we can take in research money just for fundamental research, but then we have a commercializable part of our company. And a lot of these effects, the increasing temperatures drive a lot of the cascading effects I've talked about. And so, of course, greenhouse gases and CO2 are sort of the big lever that this field is trying to pull in order to abate some of those consequences. So this slide is just showing just the discrepancy of the fact that we put 40 billions of tons of CO2 in the atmosphere every year and only draw down 40 million. So there's pretty huge discrepancy there. And I think everyone has broadly seen this figure about needing to reach net zero CO2 emissions by 2055 to limit to 1.5 degrees C, which is just, if you're actually looking at the numbers, we're going to have to pull off, I think, a World War II miracle here with basically getting, broad societal support and everyone working on this issue. I'll talk about, for the next, I think like 10 minutes I have left, the actual solutions we're working on, and then just end with a little bit of kind of what we're seeing on our side in terms of framing and storytelling. So, in order to transition to the green world we want, and the electric vehicles and all that stuff, we're gonna have to emit a lot more carbon en route. And that's just something that we're just gonna have to take out of the air. And, carbon removal is coming back from, a place where it started, which was oil and gas. And so there's already controversy around what it is, and if it's like an excuse to keep polluting, or if we actually do need it, who agrees, who doesn't agree. I'd say it's one of the more complex narratives and issues that we're circling around right now. I think an interesting frame is that right now we're about to embark on intentionally adjusting the climate. We've been unintentionally adjusting it since the Industrial Revolution. And now, without really accounting for anything, and now we're about to go in and try and push it back the other way. And basically, hopefully that begins to work well. So because of what we do at Project Vesta, we have a lens over, all of carbon dioxide removal sort of solutions, and this is just to kind of put in a visual sense the spectrum of different things people are working on. So on the left, you'll see sort of forestry and soil and blue carbon. Those are great, and are definitely everything's needed. By the way, just the kitchen sink is needed. But for that side, when it's under temporary in the sense of you can grow pull down CO2 and convert it into biomass, and that's good for some amount of years, decades to maybe some centuries. Of course, the challenge with these solutions is that they have to be constantly maintained. If you plant a forest with a mangrove, you have to set up a monitoring program in perpetuity. That all has costs, and those all have implications. And of course, as we see with forest fires, there's a question of whether that biomass will be there in time. And then going over to the right, you have things like biochar and BECCS, which is bioenergy with carbon capture. What I'm going to talk to you about is ocean CDR, which is more on the permanent side, so ocean carbon dioxide removal. And under that is a lot of different things. And Terry might actually talk a little bit about what they're doing on AltaSea to support some of these solutions. Project Vesta fits in this little pocket called ocean alkalinity enhancement. It's a lot of syllables. So what we do at Project Vesta is a method that we call coastal carbon capture. and it's to basically use the big carbon sink of the ocean to draw down CO2 and then trap it in the ocean, basically as baking soda. And I'll go over that process at a high level in a second. But this is, you can just see the different carbon stocks, around in different places in the world. You can see that the ocean holds the vast majority of that. So when we're talking about scale, the ocean has basically the container to scale into the amount of carbon that we need to pull down. How to get the carbon in there in a way that's ethical and safe is our big challenge and our question right now. And I would say the field of oceanography is transforming into a field that generally just monitored the ocean into a field of scientists who are trying to figure out if intentionally impacting the ocean through carbon removal is a safe and ethical thing to do. So CO2 uptake in the ocean, there are two pathways. One is phytoplankton can fix carbon into biomass and then sink to the bottom of the ocean. It's kind of like the forests of the ocean. The other one is called the solubility pump, and that's actually CO2 being driven into the water, and once it's driven into the water, it gets converted into baking soda, so kind of like an alkaline solution. And that's actually our biggest carbon removal pathway on Earth. So on the left side, you'll see basically over millions of years, rainwater and ocean water have been interacting with certain minerals on the planet. When they interact with these minerals, it pulls carbon dioxide into the water and traps it in a form called alkalinity, which then eventually turns into limestone. And this is actually how CO2 has been brought down for millions of years for us to actually thrive on this planet. So at Vesta, what we're trying to do is speed up that process. And you'll see that on the right side. So basically that involves finding these naturally occurring minerals, grinding them into sand, and spreading them in coastlines to increase the dissolution rate of these minerals, because when they dissolve, they trap carbon dioxide. And the mineral that we use, there are different minerals around the world, but the mineral we use is called olivine. It's probably the most abundant mineral on Earth's mantle. There are large deposits all over the world, and there wasn't a big market for it until the carbon market got created. And once the carbon market was created, olivine was kind of the mineral that could potentially dissolve the fastest to pull down the most carbon dioxide. So this is our kind of simple process. It's simple in theory. Of course, when you get out there and in the application world, it's a lot more complex, but it's actually nice in the sense that if you put olivine in the water in the right way, it'll keep dissolving and pulling down CO2, and you don't really have to do anything else. It's almost like this set it and forget it thing, or a mechanism. But you do have to monitor it to see if you can pull down CO2 and then eventually turn it into carbon credits. So none of this would be possible without the carbon market. The carbon market is kind of the first time we've actually put a real price on some natural resource that to restore, and because of that, it's galvanized a lot of investment into this space. So our three-part is that we treat the symptoms. We can lay sand down on the coastlines, and actually it mitigates wave action, so it protects coastlines, and we have some pilot projects around that right now. It also reduces the ocean acidification at the same time because it converts CO2 into alkalinity. It removes CO2 from the air, of course, helping reverse climate change. And then we're also talking with another huge industry, the coastal nourishment industry, which basically goes to coastlines every few years and nourishes them with sand to stop the erosion process or to mitigate it. It's really expensive. The world's running out of sand. It's another interesting story. So we are coming in and saying, can we supplement it with carbon removing sand so that we could potentially pay for your nourishment and turn it into the carbon negative activity. So we're basically trying to partner with other industries that are already at scale, that are moving these things around. So you only need 0.25% of the shelf seas to remove 1 gigaton of CO2. So there's enough shelf seas, there's enough olivine reserves. And we need to get to a large scale, but nothing like the coal industry, nothing that the coal industry hasn't done, for example. What we are good at is moving a lot of stuff around, and that's basically what our solution calls for. And then to place things in the right way. And so I'll use the last couple minutes. Or what do I have? I know we started a little late.
You're go ahead for a couple minutes.
Okay, yeah, in the last couple minutes, I just want to end with the ethics around all of this. You know, I'm an environmental scientist. I never ever did I think I was going to get into the world of removing carbon intentionally. And I think right now the data is just showing us we're in a different place in the environmental science world. You know, if anything, we are the ones that are closest to understanding how to modify the environment. I call us a little bit like the doctors of the world. But we weren't really looked at like that until people started agreeing that things were wrong broadly in the environment. So to me, it's how can we use the technology to build the new world. I think a lot of the times the human element has been left out of technological development, and we're seeing fallout from that right now. I think social media is a great example of that. So what we try and do at Project Vesta is when we work with communities, we create participatory governance frameworks to integrate local and native inputs into our process, and then basically help stimulate local development with them doing climate-related development. And so I can talk about examples around that if we'd like. But generally speaking, I think what we're looking at is we need a massive alignment. We need everything from policy to storytelling to funding. Terry and I were just talking about just like the sheer scale that we need of this response. And so we talk a lot to congressional offices and former lobbying groups that made laws for oil and gas, and just to understand what they did to create their own subsidies, because we're going to need, I think, subsidies for things like carbon removal. Yeah, and I'll just end with the importance of framing. Last interesting nuance is MIT Tech Review came out with an article, and they were talking about the challenges of our process, which is great, coming from a scientific study that kind of called out sort of the challenges of this type of carbon removal. And the scientists didn't want to paint a bad picture of it. It's just the reporter took the words and then spun it into a place of doubt, which was the opposite of what he wanted. He wanted to just call out the implications and the caution, but not to essentially scare people away from the field. So I think there's an impossible, hard challenge for storytellers to report on things that are authentic and real, without maybe also steering it down a path where support is not there anymore. So I'm just going to end on that, and thank you for listening.
All right, I guess then it's up to me. I'll stand over here so I can also take off my mask temporarily. Glad to see we got a few of the people from the main session. So I'm Terry Tamminen. I, as was mentioned, was the Secretary of the California EPA for Governor Schwarzenegger, and been working since then with the UN Green Climate Fund on financing carbon solutions at scale and climate solutions at scale in developing countries in particular. And now as President and CEO of AltaSea of the Port of Los Angeles, I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment and how that all ties into all this. Interesting you mentioned Miami. So in 1989, Andrew Revkin, who was working for the New York Times back then, you may know, a good science writer, wrote a book for a foundation I was working for the late Frank Wells, who was the president of Disney at the time. He started the Environment Now Foundation, and he funded one of the first touring exhibits for museums about climate change in '89. I remember it was, what, '84 when Al Gore had the first hearing in Congress about climate change, this new thing. So '89, big interactive exhibit with hands-on exhibits. How does CO2 in the atmosphere work, and so on and so on. And this book, one of the chapters in the book was about sea level rise and what the implications would be. And they used Miami Beach, not even the whole city of Miami, but just the tiny city of Miami Beach as a case study. And they predicted, based on the science at the time, that within 30 years, from 1989, they would probably have to spend money to lift the roads in Miami Beach and put in pumps for dry weather flooding. Not even the more intense storms and hurricanes and so forth, but the kind of dry weather flooding. Fast forward about 15 years ago, the city of Miami Beach spent $500 million to raise the roads and put in pumps for dry weather flooding. One of my clients over the last 10 years was a guy named Leonardo DiCaprio, and he started a foundation, and I was helping him deploy his philanthropy and his storytelling, and he did a documentary which is quite well worth watching called Before the Flood. And I'll just digress for a second and mention that a great introduction to climate change you can have in 3 hours. An hour and a half of watching Al Gore and Inconvenient Truth, and then an hour and a half of watching Leo's documentary 10 years later, which basically Al Gore lays out the science. 10 years later, Leo comes along and he goes to all these places and he says everything you heard that Al Gore was predicting and the scientists were predicting is happening and faster. So one of the sections in that documentary, we go to Miami Beach and we interview the mayor at the time, who was finishing these $500 million of improvements years earlier than was predicted by the science. And Leo just, asks him, well, how long will this new $500 million infrastructure last before you have to do more? And the mayor said, maybe 30 years, and we're gonna have to raise the roads again, maybe even abandon Miami Beach. And today, you cannot get a 30-year mortgage for any property in Miami Beach because the banks know something, the insurance companies know something that the scientists also know, but the public, especially in Florida, likes to ignore. So, and interesting today, literally as we're sitting here, the streets of Miami are underwater because of just a regular storm. It's not even a hurricane, but more intense storms, more water, etc. So all of this is very real, and the science has been predicting this, of course, for decades. As you all know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, part of the UN, for 30 years now, every 5 years comes out with their assessment and says, what do we know from all the peer-reviewed studies? And if you're not familiar with the IPCC, it really is an unprecedented level of science rigor. I don't know any other endeavor or area of research in the world that has the scientists from 190 countries all getting together to write these assessments based only on peer-reviewed science and only on stuff that all the scientists can agree should go into that next assessment. So you get a lot of stuff that's more extreme one way or the other that doesn't make it in there if it can't get consensus. This is truly unprecedented. And yet, the very first assessment back 25 years ago said that humans were 66% likely to be the cause of climate change and that it was very real. 5 years later, it became 80 or 90%, and we were definitely responsible, etc. And of course, now the last assessment is there's absolutely no doubt that humans are the main cause of what we're observing in the changing climate. And the other interesting thing that you get from those assessments, much like that Miami Beach story, which is important for science writers, is that, of course, science likes to have a range. They like to say, well, it could be as little as this, but it could be as much as that. So the public tends to think, well, all right, it must be somewhere in the middle. In fact, if you look at the vast majority of the predictions, and you go to the highest end of the predictions, that's really what's been happening, and even beyond that. And that's certainly the case with that Miami Beach example. I'll give you another one. 25 years ago, I was the Santa Monica Baykeeper. I was out in a patrol boat, nonprofit, trying to identify sources of pollution and degradation to the bay. We were replanting kelp so that we could actually report to the public not just what's happening wrong in the bay and who's polluting it and so forth and how do you stop it, but if we do stop it, can you bring back the ecosystem? Kelp, which supports 800 species, was a great way to do that, to replant the trees of the ocean, to be able to say that yes, we can restore this ecosystem and prove that improving water quality will do it. And while I was doing that, I got a call one morning that there was a baby whale that had washed up on the beach near Marina del Rey where our boat was. And so I go out with my houseboat or my patrol boat rather, and sure enough, there was this baby gray whale that had beached itself. Some lifeguards had pushed it back in the water, and it was cruising around looking for its mother. It had obviously been born prematurely because normally the gray whales would get all the way to Mexico, give birth there, and the mother had obviously continued migrating or somehow lost contact with the baby. And so for about 36 hours, we shadowed it. It came up to our boats looking for a nipple on the bottom of the boat. There was the whale rescue team, Peter Wallerstein and I did this all night long while we were trying to get permission from the NOAA and other officials to try to rescue this animal, and from SeaWorld, which was the only place that could possibly do anything with an orphan like this. We had to get a truck and all kinds of other things, but amazingly, we finally got permission. We were able to coast the baby up to the beach. A makeshift stretcher, and hundreds of people had come together to work on this, to get her into this stretcher, onto a flatbed truck, into a rider truck that the only person in my organization at that time with a credit card was literally this tall, and she went out and got the rider truck, but because she had it, it was her license, she was the only one allowed to drive it. So this little old lady who had volunteered to just go rent the truck suddenly was driving down the 405 freeway at 70 miles an hour with a whale in the back, a police escort, and news choppers overhead. If you look this up, there's a lot of video from back then, 25 years ago. We got it to SeaWorld amazingly for a year. They kept her there. They named her JJ after a recently departed veterinarian who had volunteered a lot of time to SeaWorld. They nursed her along. She grew to normal young adult size. In fact, of course, exceeded their capability to keep her there. And she was released back into the wild a year later, quite successfully. And then because of this kelp restoration project, about 3 months later, of course, they put trackers on her, and she scraped those off right away, going down to the bottom, scraped them off within hours. So of course, everyone lost touch with her. About 3 months later, I was out off Palos Verdes planting kelp with a couple of volunteers, and we see this young adult whale surfacing and going down. We took pictures, so we managed to get the fins and so forth, and ultimately identified that it was JJ. And there was a baby whale with her that she was teaching how to go to the bottom and feed. And obviously could not have been her calf, but it's known in gray whale biology that the aunties, as they're called, will adopt orphan babies and help teach them how to survive. And so we last saw her heading north, as at that time of year she should have been, with this baby in tow, teaching it how to feed and swimming north. So we hope that she survived. The reason I tell you this story is that at that time, science was telling us that the acidification of the ocean was going to be slowly wiping out the amphipods, the crustaceans that they feed on. And the gray whales, they travel thousands of miles up to the Arctic every summer. They feed, they get fat, and then they travel back down to Baja, Mexico to give birth to mate and give birth to their young. And then they do the whole thing all over again. And so the amphipod populations are being decimated, and the guess was that this whale that should live to be about 75, they have remarkable similar biology to humans. This amazing whale should live to about 75, would probably die of starvation at the age of 50 because of ocean acidification and the trends that science was predicting would happen to her food supply. Well, today she would be about 25, and if you Google this, you'll see that over the last several years, more and more gray whales have been washing up on the beaches of Oregon and Washington, starved to death. It's already happening, decades before it was predicted. She won't make it to 50. None of them will. And it's all because we're acidifying the ocean. And as Nathan pointed out, the ocean has this amazing absorptive capacity. In fact, roughly, and you'll correct me as the scientist in the room if I get this wrong, but roughly a third of all the excess CO2 that we're pumping into the atmosphere has been absorbed by the ocean. Otherwise, our concentrations in the atmosphere would be even worse, and our current consequences would be even greater. In fact, the report just came out a few days ago that we hit yet another record, 423 parts per million. And some of you may know that the pre-industrial levels were about 250, so we've now almost doubled pre-industrial levels in just 100 years or so. And that excess amount of CO2 that would otherwise be going into the atmosphere is absorbed by the ocean. Now, the atmosphere may have unlimited capacity to keep doing that, to keep absorbing it. Obviously, temperatures will continue to go up and other consequences will continue to be felt, but the ocean doesn't. The ocean is more like a sponge, where you can absorb a certain amount of water, and then at some point it can't take anymore. And so the notion of direct air capture, taking carbon out of the atmosphere, think about how much volume of air you have to process to get CO2 out of that atmosphere. But water is so much more dense that if you can use these various methods that Nathan is talking about, and there's others that try to de-acidify the ocean, then and you're effectively taking carbon out of the ocean and giving the ocean more ability to absorb. Now, sad that we're saying this amazing ecosystem that covers 2/3 of our planet, we're just trying to make it a landfill that has more capacity. But as Nathan pointed out, it's going to take a lot of burning of fossil fuels before we get to the perfect. Every car that gets sold today is going to be on the road for an average of 20 years, and of course getting more and more polluting as it gets older and older, and there's millions of cars and trucks being sold every single day. Nobody's going to walk away from those investments because they care more about their kids, sadly. But, so what is the solution to all of this, and how does this relate to you? So, based on my experience, it's policy, technology, and finance. And I think science writers tend to focus mostly on the technology. What's the science? What are the cool things that people like Nathan are discovering, and then how are those applied? And then you stop there. Well, if it stays a science experiment, it's not a solution. You need the policy, the technology, and the finance. Let me give you a couple of examples of how that actually works. So in California, some years ago, we wanted to try to get more renewable energy on the grid. So we passed laws called renewable portfolio standards. It basically said utilities, you have to get 20% of your energy from renewable sources within the next 10 years. We don't care how you do it. It's up to you to do it. And then we accelerated that to 25%, then 50%, and now 75%, and now there's a goal of 100% by 2045. And by having that policy signal, it then meant that the utilities would go out and start contracting with private developers who could do more solar or energy efficiency. That's another one where Jerry Brown, in his first terms in office in the 80s, he created the California Energy Commission. One of the most important things they do is regulate efficiency of appliances. They started with refrigerators. They figured out how much energy could be taken off the grid by replacing refrigerators. And they also came up again with the policy. It wasn't just enough to say, well, okay, from now on, new refrigerators have to be cleaner or have to be more efficient. They said, well, most people don't buy a refrigerator every day. So how do we accelerate that transition? So they created a program where there was an incentive to buy back the old inefficient refrigerators, so you'd have a few bucks and you'd be incentivized to go replace your other ones sooner and learn that, hey, it might even pay for itself over time with energy savings. So policy got the technology that already existed, the more efficient refrigerators, and a finance mechanism to make it happen that much faster. The solar initiative, Arnold started the Million Solar Roofs Initiative, which was the goal to get 1 million rooftops in California covered with solar. But at the time, solar was very expensive, 2006-07 when we passed that law. And so the idea was we followed a German model, which was that we found some money where we could give people 50% of the cost of their solar system in the first year. If you bought solar now, we're gonna pay for half of it. But if you wait a year, we're only gonna pay for 40%. If you wait 2 years, we're only gonna pay for 30%. So that made everybody jump right away. It also got the electricians, the roofers, all of the people that have to build these systems and install them to move more quickly. And then financing mechanisms. People that would say, well, look, we know even at paying for half of it, the other half is expensive, but what if we finance it like you would a car? Or what if we put it on for free and you just agree to pay for the electricity that comes off your roof, and the installer will get a little bit of margin on top of that. So innovations in finance happened because the technology was there, but because policy helped to drive it. And by the way, today, 10 years or now 15 years after that program got started, we estimated that we would get about 3 gigawatts of solar from those million roofs. We hit the million roof target in 2019, and it was 8 gigawatts. So people bought more, and businesses bought more than we ever thought because of this program. So we far exceeded our goals, and the mass production brought the price down to the point where today the price is less, in fact about 30% less than it would have been with the subsidies. Now you don't need the subsidies. There still are some, of course. But so the policy is really important to drive the technology, but then you've got to get the finance in there to make it real. Otherwise, it isn't going to happen. There's other examples, and now in India, just to give you an international example, when Modi came into office, he created 2 programs that completely changed something in India. One was the Swachh Bharat program, which means clean up India. And he said, I want to put everybody on a toilet, and I at least give access to them to sewage, modern sewage, and I want to clean up all the garbage in the streets, so every town's going to have a landfill and some method of collection. You go to India today, and it's a transformation in just 7 or 8 years. It's unbelievable. Most people have at least access to sewage. Now, many people still are not on it. There's a lot of people in rural areas that don't have toilets and plumbing and so forth. But it's come to all of these rural towns, at least, where more and more people have access. And the landfills, it's amazing. Every little town has some kind of collection program and a landfill. Problem is, the landfills are overflowing. And the sewage treatment, much like even here in California, not only results in wastewater, which can be used in many ways, but sludge, which kind of can't. And yet there is a lot you can do with that biological material. So the Swachh Bharat program generated all of this aggregation of the material. The other program was the SATAP program, which is because India doesn't have an oil and gas industry, they buy all of their fossil fuels from somebody else. Well, the one thing they have a lot of is biological material. Most of this garbage that's going to landfills now, or about half, not most, about half, is organic. Food waste and agricultural waste and other kinds of organic waste. And when you add in the sludge, you got a lot of organic material that can be put into existing technology, anaerobic digesters, and turned into biogas. And so India is then preferring all kinds of, whether it's the buses, the tuk-tuks, the taxis, other fleets, to run on compressed natural gas, that the compressed natural gas is coming from this biogas. Now, again, there are some problems with biogas burning in a vehicle, but it's a lot cleaner than what's been on the streets today, and it's a domestic industry that is also taking a lot of this organic material out of landfills that otherwise would be decomposing into methane, which is 26 times more potent as a greenhouse trapping gas than CO2, although not as long-lived, so the trade-offs. But the bottom line is you're getting a win-win, and it's because of the policy, the technology was already there, and then the financing of this makes sense because there are these mandates in place. So how does this apply to the oceans? Well, as we heard, direct air capture or ocean capture of one kind or another is very important, but it's very hard to get that done without a price on carbon. And that's where government steps in. When I was EPA Secretary, we created the Global Warming Solutions Act, which includes a carbon cap and trade system, much like the European system, which can go into the details of that if you're interested, but the bottom line, it puts a price on carbon. But today, it's still in the, $10 to $50 a ton range. And to make a lot of these technologies work, direct air capture in particular, you need $300 to $500 a ton. Now the good news is that a lot of big corporations, and this hasn't been well reported, but a lot of big corporations are doing shadow pricing of carbon at that rate, somewhere between 100 and 300. I don't think I've heard anyone go above that. But what that means is they require all of their divisions to look at their P&L and say, what would happen if you had to pay a $100 to $300 a ton price on carbon in your P&L? Where would you put that? What would happen to the profitability of your division? And therefore, you better start figuring out how to reduce your carbon footprint. And in some cases, some companies like Microsoft and others are actually charging their division leaders in the P&L that amount, and then the money goes off to invest in, cleaner technologies or more energy efficiency or offsets or whatever else. So they're actually charging themselves this amount. So I'm hopeful that over time we will get to that. Even the oil companies have said they prefer to have some kind of a global price on carbon, because Rex Tillerson, who was Trump's first Secretary of State, came from Exxon. Even he advocated, of course he only wanted a $25 a ton global price on carbon, but even he said, rather, as a business that operates in hundreds of countries, we don't want to have different patchwork things in the United States, a patchwork in California and somewhere else, etc. So let's have one global price on carbon. So I do think over time we'll get there, but it's not fast enough to do things like this. So you need a policy signal. You need, again, some kind of an industry mandate or regulations or subsidy. This is, again, where enlightened government subsidy comes in. And I was talking to Jonathan Pershing yesterday, who was an advisor to John Kerry when he was Secretary of State, and then again in his current role as climate ambassador, and he works at the Hewlett Foundation. He'd been at WRI, so he's a good scientist. And he said, you know, we've estimated that about $1 trillion of government investment could get the United States to zero carbon within 15 or 20 years. And everybody says $1 trillion, oh my God, you couldn't do that. Well, we've just passed trillions of dollars of stimulus programming. We had a $3 trillion war in Iraq that was entirely about a barrel of oil. And you know, we've spent probably $1 trillion and more dealing with COVID because we had to. Well, this is one of those existential crises that we have to do something about. So the last piece I want to just talk about then is AltaSea and how this ties in to what you're thinking about today with the ocean. So AltaSea in the Port of Los Angeles is a nonprofit that Port of Los Angeles donated, in essence, a 35-acre campus to in the port. It's 100-year-old warehouses that were built originally to take cargo from what at the time was the newly constructed Panama Canal. And so they're one-story warehouses. They're amazing old architecture. And we've raised the money to start renovating them into a modern research, education, workforce development, and commercialization hub for blue technology. And that includes things like aqua farming, kelp in particular. USC has a great kelp lab there. You're welcome to come down and see it. It's really amazing. And they are breeding different kinds of kelp and other seaweed to extract food, fuel, pharmaceuticals. One of the companies that spun off out of this research has a preservative for vaccines that when it's approved by the FDA, you won't have to refrigerate the COVID vaccine. Think about how many people would be alive today if that discovery from the ocean had already been commercialized. So aqua farming, new methods of doing that on land and at sea. Then renewable energy. We've got an Israeli company that's finally kind of cracked the code of how to do cheap and durable wave energy. They're going to be demonstrating at our facility other kinds of really innovative renewable energy technologies coming out of the ocean, and things like carbon capture and hydrogen. We're working on ways to produce hydrogen from seawater, which can then be a clean fuel, especially for shipping and trucks, heavy duty things that haven't decarbonized yet. And then finally, technology. So things like underwater robotics. Bob Ballard, who found the Titanic, keeps his vessel there, and he's got a workshop there where he builds his underwater robots and sensors, teaches it to high school kids. They build their little robots with him and throw them off our pier, and half of them sink and half of them float. But it's a great hands-on educational experience, and then we do workforce training and so forth there. But I invite you all to come down. Even as we're renovating, we've got a number of these tenants there that are demonstrating these things. Dr. Sant, whose engineering department is right over there somewhere. Gaurav Sant is doing a carbon capture program from seawater that will be installed there very shortly. Caltech is doing something. We invite Nathan to come. We invite all of you to come see it. And you know, I mentioned I started this with talking about JJ the whale, and you know, the only reason that she survived is because over 200 people in those 36 hours checked their egos and their politics and whatever at the door. People from all walks of life came together, and we saved this baby whale. If we can do that, we can do this. But it's going to take storytelling and communication, and again, not just saying, oh, here's the science, oh yeah, it works or it doesn't, oh yeah, it's a false hope, it's a real hope, whatever. What are the policy implications and the financing that make that technology and those discoveries real? So I encourage you, as you tell your stories, to look at all three parts of those solutions. Thank you.
Would you mind, we'll have our experts sit up here. They can sit at the two ends of the table, and they'll be spaced properly. And we'll open it for questions. Please introduce yourself and ask your question as succinctly as possible, so we can get in as many questions as possible. And if none of you are committed for our break, we can go a little over the time. So go ahead. Yes?
Hi, Carol Suchman. I'm with the Science Literacy. I was just wondering, you hear so much more about plastics in the ocean. So does that affect the acidity? And are you, is the philanthropy up against each other, or are you working with the people trying to remove all the plastics as well as doing what you're doing? Is it synergistic, or is it, are you, disparate with them?
Yeah, so plastics, there's like two big issues, of course, with the plastics, which is like trying to remove them and then trying to create new supply chains that replace that plastic. It doesn't necessarily directly contribute to ocean acidification per se. What it is though, doing is that it's presenting yet another stressor. So like, imagine like you're sick and then you get exposed to another ailment and your immune system's already weakened. That's kind of what it's doing to a lot of ecosystems, is that it's presenting this other stressor and they're already dealing with other things. So it's weakening it from that perspective. In my work, we work with companies that are trying to convert seaweed into like seaweed pellets, so that they can go into the injection molding machines of plastic, like single-use plastic things. So we're trying to integrate it into existing supply chains to see if we can get to scale sooner. And then I think the nonprofits like the Four Oceans have this great community model to get people involved. And obviously there are a lot of other ways of interception. The philanthropy is an interesting one. Maybe you can comment too, because philanthropy, of course, is in the nonprofit world and relying on, sort of like certain foundations to grant to a lot of different nonprofits. And there is a bit of competition there, which is, I think why we're trying to build new kind of a new economy, new industries around it, because that's more driven by market forces. But yeah, there's, I think, no straightforward from me on sort of like that part of it.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add is I don't know if plastics contribute to acidification or deacidification. It's certainly an area for study. Some recent studies have shown that as they break down, they do actually release more greenhouse gases than we thought. But I think so far everything I've seen in terms of trying to clean it up is well-intentioned but misguided, that you can't clean it up because people go out to the garbage patch and they see floating stuff and they think, oh, that's it. It's really the fact that it's breaking down into these microplastics and it's all throughout the water column being eaten by small fish, which get eaten by bigger fish, etc. And so it's a problem. You can't put that genie back in the bottle. We have to stop it at the source, which is why things like single-use plastic bag bans and straws and all those other kinds of things are very useful, and unfortunately got set back during COVID because we all started using delivery food and single-use plastics again. But there are alternatives, as Nathan said, and so we need the alternatives and we need to get people out of the plastic business.
Other question?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm just an interested citizen, so I don't really write anywhere. But one of my problems is I hear you speak, Nathan, I'm like, we got a solution. This is great. All we got to do is find all that stuff that seems to be all over the place. But kind of that's how it sounds like. There's a lot of that stuff around, and you just put it on the beach, and it washes into the ocean, and it gets clean. Or let's all go out and plant kelp, and we'll be fine. I guess I'm wrong. And I guess my question is, for you, Nathan, you were addressing that, I guess the carbon market you said, I think the carbon market has galvanized investment. So is it that you're able to sell offsets because?
Yeah, that's right. And, I think the point that Terry made is super important. As a climate scientist, I went into the world of finance because, we at Project Vesta need innovative financing to get us to a scale that's meaningful. So as an example, our projects are super expensive up front. To do a pilot project, it's a few $1 million, and then we have to prove that we can generate carbon credits, which can then pay for the project later. But that few $1 million up front would need things like program-related investments, long-term loans with low interest rates. So really, like, the innovative financing is huge. And because we can't really predict anything on a small scale until we actually try and do it at a larger scale. And I think sort of the solutions Terry is talking about, like, all the potential is there. And, I think Terry and I are on parallel paths of trying to raise even more funds to get to some place where we can look at it at a larger scale. AltaSea is no trivial thing to fundraise for, and for us as well. So I think to Terry's point, when he mentioned sort of the $1 trillion investment, that's really where, we start to get into like a full kind of infrastructural investment build. Right now, it's the money is not, it's not too plentiful. Like, it's a lot of money, but relative to where we need to go, it's actually not too much. So we're still boots, kind of like on short runway times and sprinting. So there's constraints that way. Then the policy is super important too. And I actually had a question for you about that, where, at the federal level, it just seems like immovable. But it seems like at the state level, a lot more can happen. And for example, I think Tesla became profitable because California passed the law where all car manufacturers had to sell EVs, electric vehicles in California. No one could do that really but Tesla, so Tesla started selling their EV credits to everyone else to actually become profitable. I think that's a great example of policy.
Right.
And so for me, that's kind of like, the solutions are there, and I think we're really good at being like, here's the path to try it, and then there's still a blocker for raising sort of that type of resources to walk the path. But yeah.
Just a follow-up explanation, because I know nothing about this, but when you say innovative financing as opposed to financing, it's all you need money, right?
Yes, yeah. So like, for example, I like to use the biotech industry as an example, and then maybe you probably have some good examples. But for example, like, developing a drug to get to the level of, pass FDA and all the trials, I mean, that takes like hundreds of millions of dollars and like a decade. And I would say a lot of that money initially comes from taxpayer money, doing research and development, getting government grants from NIH, or foundations that are really passionate about like multiple sclerosis or something that they're passionate about. So a lot of the development of this stuff comes from what's called like non-dilutive funding, so just like grants. And then once it's at a level where like, oh, that looks like it could be inserted into the market and be profitable, then investor money comes in and takes it to scale. And so that's normal in biotech, but it hasn't been normal in climate necessarily. Or like, let's say in the military industrial complex, it's normal to like have taxpayer money to develop technology. We need that in the climate space in like the same regard. And so that's kind of what I mean is like, there needs to be a lot of blended financing, not just investors coming in. I don't know if you have anything.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. There, you need to get some upfront money to get over that valley of death. I mean, I've worked with a lot of different financial institutions and conventional investors. Yes, they want to see that something worked at a lab, and they want to see that something worked at a larger scale that proves that it can scale up. But then they want to see the full-scale commercial facility for a year or more to prove that it's durable and what's the operating expense and so on and so on. And that's kind of hard to do when you're in a startup mode. And the other thing is we're running out of time, and that's where the government funding becomes so important, or the philanthropic money. Like you said, program-related investments, some philanthropy will give you money, they know they might lose it, and then it becomes a grant, but if they don't, you pay it back without interest, so then they can recycle their money again, so program-related or mission-related investing. So that kind of stuff is just so valuable to get through that valley of death to the point where then commercial investors will jump in.
Next question, we had a question here.
Yeah, name's Ariel, just an interested software engineer, but I was just curious, is there an interaction between distributing sand and the sea levels themselves?
Distributing sand and then sea level rise?
Yeah, or just like how it interacts with it in general?
Yeah, I mean, we're actually piggybacking off of like a whole huge industry called the coastal nourishment industry that the U.S. Army Corps is kind of the stewards of. But basically, what they're very nervous about is sea level rise and erosion. And so one of these soft solutions, building like a wall is like a hard solution. Coastal nourishment is a soft solution where you place the sand in certain ways that it dissipates wave energy. And so that dissipation will help protect coastlines. It's like kind of what coral reefs do for coastlines, the waves are dissipated. But they have to do that every few years. So it's not, it's kind of this temporary solution. It's super expensive. No one knows who's going to pay for it really. That's why they were interested in talking to us. But that's really, an immediate solution that is kind of apolitical. Climate change is still a politically charged thing. So if we're working with a red state on the coast, we talk more about job creation. If we're working like in a progressive state, we'll talk about climate change. So it really depends. saving coastlines is actually like a bipartisan thing, like one of the few bipartisan things that exists. So that's the path we take to try and familiarize people with like the solution.
We have a question, yeah, back here.
So CARB just released its new scoping plan, and they are actually forecasting 25% reliance on CDR technology and also increased reliance on the cap and trade system. As you guys both know, and I just was curious, when you look at that plan and you're interested in the proliferation of the technologies that you guys are thinking about, what are you most interested in having CARB, which is like, you know, the quarterback in the climate space, do? And yeah, what are you guys most paying attention to that's going to be most important to enable these technologies?
Well, for me, on the policy side, so one of the things we've been working on for a number of years with CARB is linking the California cap and trade system, which includes Quebec, to the Chinese system, which is just emerging, to harmonize those with the same kind of measuring, reporting, verifying, and tradability credits, and then ultimately linking that with the 10 northeastern US states and the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which right now only regulates CO2 in power plants, but get them up to the same level as California and China. And then link that with the European trading system, because if you have one global system, at that point you'd have 40% of the world's economy with a cap and trade program. Then you can start bumping up the numbers to where the price on carbon becomes more meaningful and can finance projects like this. And it allows you then, to this point you were raising earlier, Nathan, a lot of countries won't do it for political reasons, but states and other subnationals will. California and Quebec are proving that we can be economies trading with, with other countries and creating these market systems. So in Brazil, for example, we've been working with 24 of their 27 state governors who disagree with the Bolsonaro administration, and getting them to look at different kinds of solutions for the Amazon, but also for climate, and potentially getting into cap and trade systems. So one way or the other, the goal is to try to get a price on carbon, because I do think that's one of the missing pieces when we look at that solution set.
Yeah, that's completely right. The carbon markets is just another fun, chaotic thing to write about. It's just so complicated. And what a lot of people are trying to do is just get a global carbon market so everyone knows, kind of how to benchmark. For me, I think in my journey, what I've realized for myself is that all of these are such global problems, and when you try and tackle it at that level, it just becomes so complicated. There are a million stakeholders, and like no one agrees on anything. And so I've actually now kind of thought to myself, like, we kind of need to create really, really good, almost local, regional examples of stuff, so that other people can look at it and be like, okay, they did it, how do we adapt it? And to your point about state level policy, I mean, I've seen so many amazing initiatives actually happen on the state level, whereas like, just trying to get Build Back Better through anything and having it basically torn apart. Just a good example of, trying to do things on the federal level is, for now, really difficult. One thing we have been trying to do at the federal level is we've been trying to find policies where if we could just change it by like a sentence, it will open up the space for a lot more technologies and investment. So there's this policy called 45Q that oil and gas lobbying firms wrote a while ago that basically gave tax subsidies to oil and gas who pulled down carbon dioxide to direct air capture, but they wrote it so narrowly that it only applies to their technology. So we've been trying to talk to congressional offices to see how we can amend the bill to put in a sentence that's just a little bit more liberal about the type of direct air or like carbon removal technology. And those are the things that they're little levers to pull, and it's about kind of just finding where that catalyst can be, and to pull them. And so, one, I think, this like the thing with AltaSea and certain parts of the U.S. is just doubling down and investing in those and making those systems so that they can be ported somewhere else. Because right now we're just doing a lot of arguing to try and get everyone on the same page, and that's just been really, really difficult. So I think now we're kind of just like almost hubbing up. It's not like the ideal thing, but I think it's the way to create the technologies to move where we need to go.
Okay, I think that's all we have time for. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, both of you, for your
If anybody wants to
excellent
follow up with me,
presentations.
my email